System of Georgia. Her division is responsible for meeting the information needs of the university system, ranging from overseeing collection of campus data, responding to internal and external data requests, and conducting research and analysis to guide planning, policy, and decision-making. Her research interests include student access to and success in post-secondary education, particularly related to international educational experiences and global language studies. Dr. Melissa Whatley is a postdoctoral research scholar at the Bell Center for Community College Leadership and Research at North Carolina State University, where she conducts research on issues related to community college student success. In her work, she applies advanced quantitative approaches to explore issues related to underrepresented students in U.S. international education, particularly low-income and community college students. The panelists will first share a little bit about their own current research and will then speak to a particular set of moderator set questions before we open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So I just want to reiterate something that Suzanne mentioned before I begin, that if you could please use the chat function to converse and then the separate Q&A function to actually pose particular questions during that Q&A session. And so we'll go ahead and we'll start with Dr. Bell, who will present her research first.
Great, and I'm just going to share my screen here with folks and go into slide mode. Are my slides showing?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, great. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Consortium for the Analysis of Student Success Through International Education, affectionately known as CASI. But first I wanted to go on a brief detour chatting for the benefit of the students in the room about how I came to lead this project. So prior to enrolling at IHE, I am a graduate. I was a high school foreign language teacher for 9 years and took students on trips abroad, scary high school students. This shaped my interests in as I applied to IHE, and I actually proposed in my application to want to do research on outcomes for study abroad back in 2003. As I began my coursework though, I got really pulled into policy, particularly state policy, and wound up focusing on post-secondary access for underrepresented students. But my last assistantship was my current co-PI, Don Rubin, who's on the call, on a federally funded project looking at a variety of student outcomes for students who participate in study abroad in Georgia called Glossary. This included asking for and working with USG student data, actually. I went on to be a researcher in West Virginia for 6 years and then took my current position in 2014 at USG. And when the Federal International and Foreign Education Office posted a grant competition in 2017, Don Rubin reached back out to me. We met for coffee and decided to pursue the grant, expanding the Glossary project to a national consortium and looking at more types of international education and focusing on the current policy college completion agenda. We got the grant and here we are. So what is CASI? A national collaborative led by USG to conduct research on international education experience and student success, providing participating campuses information on their student outcomes. Maybe I should click this out. There we go. Is that better? There we go. Providing participating campuses information on their students their outcomes for their students compared with other schools, and to increase collaboration on campuses to assess international education. We're funded by a 3-year grant from the Office of International and Foreign Language Education. The CASI team consists of, as I said, me and Don Rubin, former UGA faculty as co-PIs, a team of researchers at USG, including Sean Baser, our phenomenal IHE graduate research assistant. We partner with the Institute for International Education to help with outreach and also work with the USG International Education Office. The study abroad research questions are: what's the relationship between students' participation in study abroad and the academic outcomes of graduating in 4 or 6 years, time to degree, credit hours earned at degree, and GPA at graduation. We also carry out analyses for critical underrepresented subgroups by race, ethnicity, financial need, and STEM, who tends to be underrepresented in study abroad. And then also we're looking at the effect of different program characteristics. So to investigate these questions, we built a consortium of all USG schools and invited institutions across the country to join. To do so, they had to submit student level data on their fall 2010 and 11 first-time freshman cohorts. And then provide data on them for prior academic achievement, demographic characteristics, education abroad experiences, and then term by term academic progress, including their completion of credentials. So first I'll talk about our full sample analyses, which consisted of about 222,000 bachelor-seeking first-time freshmen from 37 institutions across the country, about 14% of whom studied abroad. Rather than provide research tables, I want to give you a glimpse into some of the products we're providing back to our consortium members that are designed to be accessible to practitioners and ready for use in campus planning and decisions about policy and resources around study abroad. So our descriptive information, our sample shows that those who study abroad have higher high school GPAs and SATs than those who don't. They're also less likely to be receiving need-based financial aid and less likely to be part of an underrepresented minority category. These differences in who do and don't study abroad require that we use methods that mitigate for selection bias. So we use a combination of exact and nearest neighbor matching in our analyses. We provide the infographic here at Wright to our schools to help them explain the statistical procedures in lay terms as they use the materials. So here are our matching estimates for the full sample. The top row there, you see that comparing those who studied abroad to those who didn't, those who study abroad are 3.8 percentage points more likely to graduate in 6 years and 6.2 percentage points more likely to graduate in 4 years. Moving down, conditional on those who graduated, those who study abroad finish in 0.16 semesters faster than those who don't study abroad. They do have slightly more credit hours earned, but it's only about 2 hours, not even a class. And then our study abroad participants have higher GPAs at graduation of 0.12. So this is our full sample. Next, we'll move on to analyzing how those relationships may vary for underrepresented groups. The size of our data set allows us to carry out these same matching estimates for individual subcategories. As I mentioned earlier in the descriptives for the full sample, our study abroad students were less likely to be low income as a proxy by receiving need-based aid or be a member of an underrepresented minority group. So 10% of need-based aid recipients study abroad, while 16% of non-need-based aid students do. And while almost 16% of white students study abroad, this is actually roughly about 3 times the participation rate for Black students and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So these are the matching estimates, breaking it down on those populations. In the left column, we have the matching estimates for those who received need-based aid, comparing those who studied abroad to those who didn't. And on the right, it's the same analysis, but just among the students who didn't receive need-based aid. So in the top 2 rows, you see that on the left, that among those receiving need-based aid, students who study abroad are 6.1 percentage points more likely to graduate in 6 years and 9.1 percentage points more likely in 4 years. For those who don't receive need-based aid, those effects of study abroad are smaller. So studying abroad is associated with a greater increase in likelihood of graduating for need-based aid recipients than their more affluent peers. Moving down, for those that graduate, we see that need-based aid students who study abroad see a similar reduction in semester's degree and the same increase in GPA as do need-based aid, non-need-based aid students. At the bottom, we see that need-based aid recipients who study abroad have a larger increase in credits earned at degree than the non-need-based aid students who study abroad, but it's only about a 2-hour difference in the effect, not even a class. For the race ethnicity findings, I'm going to move away from the fancy infographics. We ran these for all racial categories, but I'll just focus on a few due to our time constraints today. Each of these estimates compares study abroad participants to those who don't study abroad within the racial category. So estimates that aren't statistically significant are grayed out, and the green ones are larger than the effect in the full sample in the first row. So for the likelihood of graduating in 6 years, we see that Black and Hispanic students and those of 2 or more races see almost twice the effect size of study abroad than the national sample. For 4-year graduation rates, Black and Hispanic students have a larger increase in the likelihood of graduating than the total sample. Moving to the right, we see slightly larger reductions in semesters to degree in the Hispanic and 2 or more races populations. For GPA at graduation, we see a larger positive effect of studying abroad for all 3 populations. However, we do also see a larger increase in the number of credits earned at graduation for Blacks and Hispanics who study abroad. So in conclusion, we do see disparities in participation, as been noted in the literature. But for those who do study abroad, we see larger positive increase in likelihood of graduating for need-based aid recipients, Black and Hispanic students, and those of 2 or more races than for all students. We also see a reduction in time to degree, which is sort of contrary to, I guess, misperceptions clearly that people who study abroad take longer to graduate. We see increase in GPA at graduation for several underrepresented populations. This suggests that studying abroad can be a tool in improving college outcomes for all students, but it also provides evidence to encourage participation in study abroad, especially among underrepresented populations, and also encourage us to remove barriers that prevent their participation. Thank you, and I'll post these slides in the chat, and so you can get the contact information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bell, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Whatley.
All right, so first of all, thank you so much for having me today. It is so nice to see so many familiar names in the attendee list. I'm really excited to at least virtually be back in IHE and to speak with you today about some of my work. For those of you who don't know me, I graduated actually not too long ago, although it feels like so much has happened since then. I graduated in May 2019 with my PhD from IHE, and as Dr. Stich said when she introduced me, I'm now a postdoc at North Carolina State University. And what I'm going to share with you today is some research that started out as part of my dissertation. So, hopefully this will give some of you an idea of how you take that dissertation work and turn it into a publication. I'll put in the chat now the citation for the study that I'm going to share for those of you who would like to learn a bit more. You'll see that Dr. Stich is also a co-author on this paper, and so I thought it was especially appropriate that I talk about it today since she's moderating our session. So a bit of background about this study. We know from previous literature, and as Angie also just mentioned in her presentation, that there are these huge disparities in who participates in study abroad along the lines of socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic identity, gender identity, parental education level. But what I was seeing as I was working on my dissertation research was that we know very little about what institutions are currently doing to address these disparities, and then perhaps what additional policies and practices could institutions adopt to improve access to study abroad for these underrepresented student populations. And so that was the broader overarching question with which, I and later Dr. Stich and we approached this research project. This is a mixed method study. Part one was a quantitative piece, was the quantitative part of the study, and that is the part that is in my dissertation. So what I did when I did this particular analysis, I took IPEDS data and merged it with data from the Institute of International Education, data about the percentage of students from each institution that studied abroad. And at this point, I am forgetting which academic year it was. I think it was 2017-18. And so what I did with these data was I estimated a regression model that predicted the percentage of students that would study abroad from each institution based on a series of institutional characteristics and student demographic characteristics that I drew from IPEDS. And I ended up with a list, based on the residuals from the regression model of institutions that just had way more students studying abroad than would be expected. And then another list of institutions with way fewer students that's participating in study abroad than you would expect. And so what happened, I took, the top 10 and the bottom 10, if you will, from those two lists, and was trying to figure out, well, what might explain how institutions got onto these two lists? What variables was I not including in my regression model that maybe I should have, or whatever. And it was puzzling looking at those two lists because the institutions seemed very similar to one another. They were, they tended to be these small, private, mostly liberal arts colleges. A lot of them were religiously affiliated. There was no clear institutional characteristic that really served to separate the two lists. I didn't look at the two lists and say like, oh yeah, that explains everything, right? And so this is the part of the project where Dr. Stich joined, and we did a qualitative content analysis of these institutions' study abroad websites, hoping to find systematic differences perhaps in the policies listed on the website or the practices listed on their websites that would provide some insight into, well, how does this institution end up, with way more students participating in study abroad than we would expect, or vice versa, right? How did we end up with these institutions that, should be sending lots of students abroad and for some reason they're not, right? And I'll just touch on a few findings from this work for the sake of time today. What we ended up finding was that there definitely were these systematic differences that may not have that you know, we didn't have information about in that quantitative piece that I started out with in my dissertation. The first piece that really separated these two groups of institutions was just the sheer amount of information that was provided on their websites. Those institutions in the top 10 list just provided all kinds of information. You know, these websites took us forever to code because there was just they were so rich in information that institutions were providing to students about study abroad. That was not the case at many of the institutions in that bottom 10 list. Another piece in our findings, it became very clear that while institutions across the board seemed to address the financial barriers to study abroad participation and that they offered scholarships, you know, they talked about how to save money, how to budget for study abroad. Institutions in that top 10 list also addressed some of the other barriers to participation that students had. So they provided social connections, opportunities to spend time with students who had already studied abroad, so that students who were maybe a bit nervous or scared about going abroad could talk with someone who had done it. They provided extensive information about host countries and travel logistics. So, you know, if you're a student thinking about study abroad and you don't have perhaps an immediate family member or an older sibling that you can ask about, you know, what is traveling internationally like, you know, that you could find that information in other places at your institution. A couple other things that these institutions in that top 10 listed, they included students' parents. They included information for students' parents on their websites. They made explicit outreach to students' parents to involve them in the process of their child, their students studying abroad. They also provided resources and did specific outreach to historically marginalized groups. So you would see, for example, resources on these websites, you know, particularly for Black students addressing issues about encountering racism abroad. You know, so what might you expect to encounter? What is the racial history of this country that you are thinking about going to, and how to prepare yourself for entering that particular environment and that culture. A final thing that we found was that in this top 10 list, institutions were offering more shorter term education abroad programs, and they were offering more faculty-led programs, which, you know, I see as important. Those short-term programs accommodate student schedules that may not be so flexible that they can go abroad for an entire semester or an entire academic year. It accommodates students who maybe have to work full-time or part-time to go to school. Those faculty-led programs are also really important, and that students often make connections with faculty members in the classroom and then decide to go abroad with this same faculty member. And so it's that relationship with that individual person that encourages study abroad participation. So those are just a few of the findings that we found in this analysis of the institutional websites. So I'll stop there. I am happy to answer additional questions about this study. I'm also, you know, I've sort of left out my some of my community college work, which is something I'm also really excited about to talk about. So I'm also happy to share some about that if you have questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both of you. We're going to move into just some specific targeted questions, and we'll start with Dr. Bell. So the data, which you both indicated, really shows sharp demographic disparities. How can administrators and coordinators work to make these programs more accessible, equitable, and appealing? What kinds of efforts are there to improve access and equity?
Thanks. I'm going to speak from a system perspective since I'm not at an institution. And you know, our analyses showed not just disparities in who participates within an institution, but some institutions just don't have opportunities. And it tends to be our less selective institutions, which disproportionately enroll low income and minoritized racially and ethnically minoritized students. And so the USG has implemented an effort called USG Goes Global that creates a consortium across the whole system to increase the number and diversity and quality of faculty-led programs across the system. So someone at Little East Georgia State College may not have opportunities at their campus, but now they have access to system-wide opportunities to participate in study abroad. And the USG takes care of all the administration of these programs and leaves it for the faculty members to enhance the quality of them. And it also enhances equity across faculty as well. So if you do become a faculty member at Little East Georgia, you might not have an opportunity to study abroad were it not for the USG saying, we're recruiting faculty to lead these programs for all students across the system. So it sort of alleviates the administrative burden on campuses, provides more opportunities to more students at different types of institutions. So I see this as a way that a system can engage to increase opportunities for all of its students.
Wonderful. And we do have just a very specific question pop up in the Q&A from Justin Jeffrey. Sorry if he missed this portion of the data that you presented, but Dr. Bell, did you examine the intersection of race and need-based aid recipient status?
Yes, and we find what you would anticipate finding, that students who are racial, ethnic, underrepresented minority groups are more likely to be receiving need-based aid.
Excellent, thank you.
We did not examine the sort of the interaction of the effect yet, so still more work to do.
Excellent. And Dr. Whatley, did you want to follow up on that particular question?
Well, I will actually address another question that has come in the Q&A that I've been looking at since it came in. So the question is, did either project look at incentives for out-of-state students to study abroad? So for example, if you are an out-of-state student and you study abroad, you may pay in-state tuition. Would this assist marginalized out-of-state students across institutions? I mean, the short answer for our study is that no, because all of the institutions on our list were private. So you don't have this in-state, out-of-state tuition differential. I mean, it is interesting in and of itself that no public institutions were on either of our lists, right, from our quantitative analysis. But we did not see any evidence of lower tuition if you study abroad, or certain students have access to lower tuition if you study abroad, or anything like that in our website analysis.
I will add that the USG Goes Global program has a flat tuition rate for in-state or out-of-state students, so it could help to make that more equal.
Excellent. So I'm going to follow that up with another data-related question. What are the challenges in accessing up-to-date data and relevant data to carry out research on education abroad? And what are promising practices in overcoming those challenges?
I'll start first. As we were inviting our consortium members to participate, many did not participate because of the inability that seems to be common to link up that sort of administrative study abroad data with that broader set of student and financial aid and all those other data to carry out rigorous analyses. So many institutions just didn't participate because they couldn't put that together. It tends to be that student study abroad management software is intended for management and not for research. And so the data flows one way from the student information system into the study abroad software. So one of the things the USG is doing has helped the institutions create a system of course attributes that apply to each course that has a study abroad component, to say that it has a study abroad component, how long it is, whether it's a faculty-led program, et cetera, all these different sort of administrative characteristics of the program. And then by tying it to the course, we can link it to the student and link it to the faculty member to be able to carry out analyses. And we're collecting those all at the USG to be able to do those same analyses that the campuses can.
Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll add, you know, if you're new starting out doing research and study abroad, access to data is a big issue that you encounter pretty quickly. I mean, really, if you're looking at student level, if you want student level data, really the CASI and its predecessor, the Glossaria, are really the only two, you know, multi-institution data sources out there. You know, the solution is to do exactly what the CASI project is doing, is to start linking data sets so that you can, you know, pull study abroad participation data and link it to other data sets across an institution, and then, you know, aggregate those data together. There are some other data sources out there for international education. I'm thinking specifically of the Institute of International Education data, which is what we drew from in our study, at least for the study abroad participation piece. I will say those data are not without their issues. They are voluntarily reported. So if an institution doesn't report numbers for, international student enrollment is another variable that's in that data set, international student enrollment or study abroad participation, those sorts of things in a given year. It's unclear whether that means no students studied abroad or does it mean that the institution just didn't report that year. So it certainly doesn't come without its limitations, but that is another place to look for data. In terms of getting access to that data, I know there are some students in this session interested in doing international education research. The University of Georgia is a member of IIE's network, and as a student at a member institution, you get access to the data that is behind that login screen. I didn't know that when I started doing research on study abroad. I sort of stumbled into it. So there's a piece of information that hopefully will be useful to some of you.
I could chime in one more thing, that actually the CASI data set, part of what was written into our grant is that data set will live on and hopefully in perpetuity. And we're in the final year of our grant. And once we're done with it, we will be working to find means to make it available to other researchers to access de-identified of the institutional indicators to work with for their own research. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I see another question pop up, but I'm actually going to hold on that one because we're going in that direction. So let me ask you first, how have your research questions evolved recently? Which might be related to the question that just popped up in our Q&A box. What new data or new inquiries would you like to see explored? Start wherever you'd like.
So I think that where we need to go in our research, we have done separate analyses on study abroad program characteristics, length of programs, language taught, who the provider is, et cetera, and have findings there. But we need to do sort of the intersection of those that look at equity issues within that. Are we finding that underrepresented students are having qualitatively different experiences that may lead to different outcomes if we examine that interrelationship? But also there's these new experiences that we need to look at. We need to be looking at not just study abroad, but also service, research, and internships abroad that are part of higher education opportunities for study abroad. And then outcomes beyond college. I think people are very interested, okay, that maybe this increases your likelihood of graduating, but what does it mean? We're always being asked at the system office about those the outcomes in terms of what do students accomplish once they leave our four walls and head out into the workforce and communities. So those are some things that we'll be trying to tap into in the future.
Excellent.
And I mean, in response to that question, from my perspective, I'd like to take a step back and I'll speak to international education more broadly. So we'll take a step back from study abroad. In international education, particularly in the past, maybe decade or so, we've almost had this laser focus on international mobility. So whether that's students studying abroad for shorter periods of time, like what we've been talking about today, or students studying abroad for their entire degrees, right? So that would be what we would refer to as international students here in the United States. We've had this really laser focus on particularly student mobility and to a lesser extent, researcher mobility, going abroad to conduct research. And I think the pandemic has provided us with the opportunity, and I'll say the opportunity to pause and reflect on why we care so much about mobility. What is it that we think students are getting out of these opportunities that they aren't getting on their home institution campuses? And how might those opportunities be provided in other ways that, are perhaps more accessible to students? Students who either can't or choose not to be internationally mobile, and in ways that are better for the environment, right? And right before the pandemic started, there was a big conversation, particularly in the study abroad world, that was starting to happen about, the negative impact of what we do every day on the environment, right? So if we're just increasing mobility, we're increasing airplane trips, we're increasing emissions, it becomes an issue. And so, I think to answer that question, I think if you're going to conduct research in international education, you can't ignore the impact that the pandemic has had on international education. It is there. It has forced operations to stop in many respects. At the same time, we know very little about what students get out of these non-mobility experiences. And I'm thinking particularly about things like globalized curricula, virtual exchange, virtual study abroad, which I sort of laughed at that when I first saw that it was a thing that people were doing during the pandemic. And then I actually participated in a pilot virtual study abroad. One evening I went to Italy and it was great. And so, it was so cool. So I'll take back my initial negative reaction and say, that I think there probably are things that students get out of those experiences. But we don't know what those are. There's very little research out there about these opportunities. And so, a first step is to maybe get a better idea of what students are actually learning in these virtual or globalized, internationalized at home experiences. At the same time, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit in our conversation, I worry that on the back end of the pandemic, when study abroad, and I'll go back to study abroad now, is something that students can do again, I worry a bit that we end up with a stratification of opportunity where students who can afford to study abroad, and the students who can't afford to study abroad participate in virtual exchange or in a similar experience. And we say, okay, well, now all students have access. But one experience is providing something very different from another. And that's not to say that study abroad provides a better experience than virtual exchange, but I think the assumption might be there that study abroad is in some way better than these other international experiences. And so I hope that we will keep focus on providing maybe different experiences in different kinds of experiences, but experiences that best address students' learning needs rather than based on their economic needs, for example.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Bell, did you want to add to the discussion on kind of pandemic related issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as we emerge from the pandemic, I think that we would be missing an opportunity if we didn't take the research findings that we have to craft our narrative coming out about why study abroad is important. So to be able specifically to say, and to go to the topic of our panel today, as the benefits of study abroad, what those benefits are for student success in terms of marketing our programs to students, advocating on campuses for resources, broadening opportunities. I think that we also have an opportunity, and this is sort of out of the data sphere, but we also have an opportunity to rebuild portfolios. So we're shut down for right now. So we have a time to think more rationally about what types of programs and offerings should we be providing to students. And if we know that that minoritized students are looking for opportunities that seem that appeal to their interests, maybe more so than certain things that have been traditionally offered, we have that opportunity to rebuild our portfolio and make our portfolios more diverse to attract a broader spectrum of students to participate in those programs. It's an opportunity to step back and think about what we really want to accomplish and need to accomplish to provide equitable opportunities, and to build that up. We have a pause, and we need to use it as an opportunity and not just lemons, as someone put in the Q&A.
That's right. How do we make lemonade?
And I think that I think that too, as we come out of this, we also have an opportunity. The findings that we have on study abroad contributing to higher levels of student success, they're almost unintentional at this point. As Melissa was noting, we don't know exactly what it is that's being provided through these study abroad opportunities that does contribute to higher levels of success. We need to really get in that black box and think about what those things are, and then be more intentional about providing them, not have them be an accident, but intentionally provide the things we know in study abroad that help to leverage further success, whether that be intense faculty engagement, whether it be leaning into the discomfort of engaging with a different culture and helping students navigate that and then emerge from it with a sense of resilience and betterment that helps them and handle future challenges. So just sort of leaning into connecting study abroad to our student success efforts, and instead of letting it just be a happy accident that this is helping students succeed beyond their experience.
Right, well said. Yeah, that's wonderful. And this may be related. We have a question from Jacob Kelly about students with disabilities who study abroad, and maybe there's greater access because of the pandemic. Maybe there isn't. Can you speak to that at all? Do we have data on students with disabilities specifically? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So like most data on study abroad, that data would come from individual institutions. And I am sure that some institutions do keep track of disability status pretty well and in a way that could be merged with study abroad data pretty easily. But, I mean, similar to what the CASI project is doing, that would involve offices working with each other across campus,
Mm-hmm.
right? So while the data may exist, they probably exist in two different buckets, if you will, right? I will refer you to Diversity Abroad, which is an organization that is intended to promote diversity in study abroad. That is their goal. Diversity defined very broadly. They have, and I don't know if this initiative is still ongoing. I know that this was an initiative that they had a couple years ago. Focusing specifically on students with disabilities and study abroad. They had a working group that was focused specifically on students with disabilities. So you might look there to see what sorts of resources they have. I mean, I will share there's very little research on students with disabilities abroad.
Right.
I think in the lit review for my dissertation, I maybe identified 2 or 3 studies. I'm not aware of any that have come out since then. So.
Right.
Our data set does not include disability status. It is very intentional, Melissa, that those data sets sit in different places for privacy concerns, and it is difficult to get them to merge together. We don't collect any disability data at the USG from our constituent institutions at all. It stays at the campus level. So yeah, that really is a challenge to dig into.
Interesting. Dr. Morris has a question about distinctions between undergraduate and graduate level study abroad opportunities. Can you speak to that at all?
We did not look at all of that in our study. Our study is completely focused on undergraduates. The USG GLOW's global program I talked to you about earlier exclusively focuses on undergraduates. So I know next to nothing about that. So I yield the floor.
No
yeah,
problem.
I mean, I would say that the majority of the work that's out there on study abroad participation focuses on undergraduate students. Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, in the Institute of International Education's data, the numbers that they report, they collapse everybody together. They don't distinguish between undergrads and grad students. Graduate students, as you might imagine, don't tend to participate in education abroad. And so, my guess is those numbers are pretty low, but we don't really know too much about how many study abroad each year or anything like that.
Interesting.
There is the same grant program that we're under for our CASI project. The Institute of International Education had a grant from that same award competition called GLOW Graduate Learning Outcomes. So you may want to go to the IIE website and see if you can hunt down the GLO project, and it has information about research on graduate students.
Excellent. We have a methodological question coming in from Erin Leach. And Dr. Whatley, maybe you want to take this or speak to this on kind of the unique insights that came from the mixed methods approach to the study.
Yeah, so this was the first real mixed methods project that I worked on. And I think Dr. Stich and I, the whole time we were working on this paper, we felt like we were kind of stumbling around in the dark, like we don't really know what we're doing. And I've come to learn that that's just how mixed methods work is.
Yeah.
That, you're kind of stumbling around feeling like you have no idea what you're doing. And then you end up with something that turns out really cool. And I think we both felt that way throughout the whole process of doing this study.
Absolutely.
The piece, to speak more directly to your question, this is a mixed methods piece, and it has to exist as a mixed methods piece. One part of the study does not exist without the other. We could not pull apart the qualitative piece of the study and the quantitative piece of the study and make them two different studies. They have to be together. Without the quantitative piece, we don't know which institutions to look at, and without the qualitative piece, we don't have all those really interesting and useful findings that I discussed when I was sharing about the work. And so, I would say, unique insights came from both pieces of the study, right? So we have to be able to identify which institutions we really care about, which ones are we looking at, which ones might be the most useful to analyze for the qualitative piece. And then for the qualitative part, that's where we get the really practical application of the work. So, and Dr. Stich, if there's anything you want to add?
No, I think that was well said. I would just reiterate and emphasize the stumbling around bit. Anytime I've participated in mixed methods work, there is a little bit of that
Right.
until you find your footing and kind of come together somewhere in the middle, the radical middle, as they call it, right, Melissa?
That's right.
Where we try to kind of, really grapple with some of the underlying philosophical assumptions undergirding both quantitative and qualitative work, and kind of finding some kind of middle ground there. So always really interesting work, and always really important work, and powerful work, but difficult work.
Powerful, definitely. Because now I'm thinking we need to take the findings from your study and take it to this USG Goes Global project and sort of use it as a checklist of what are we not doing here for this system-wide project that's aimed at reducing barriers to study abroad. Right. So what can we learn from that project to say, okay, empirically, we know that these are practices that lead to better participation. So let's learn and let's apply these things.
Absolutely. I'm going to welcome additional questions from our audience members. If you have them, you can just pop them into the Q&A box. And while we're kind of waiting for additional questions, I have kind of one remaining that I'll just pose to both of you. So as we grapple with tight budgets everywhere, right? What pieces of your research do you find most compelling and important for someone looking at bottom lines to really think about and to know? What would be your kind of fun study abroad elevator speech?
I don't know that I have it down to an elevator speech, but the bottom line is we're about educating students, and ultimately they're served best if they earn the credentials they came into our institutions seeking. We have a practice that empirically we are showing improves those outcomes. So it behooves the institution to invest in and promote those practices here, study abroad, that promote student success. And not only that, but we have even larger impacts on underrepresented populations, underrepresented both in the study abroad as well as underserved historically by our institutions in terms of completion. So we can use the evidence we have to say that we need to leverage our resources in order to enhance opportunities for these students, both for the equity and opportunity, as well as to contribute in equity and outcomes.
Wonderful. And I guess I'll add to that. I think that's a challenge for international educators right now, is showing why what you do is important. And I mentioned earlier, that we've had this sort of laser focus on mobility for such a long time. And there has just sort of been this assumption in place that it's good, right? That it's good for students or it's good for the world or whatever. And I think that international educators are finding themselves in a place now where they have to show that it's good. That ends up being a bit harder to do than maybe people were anticipating, right?
Sure.
At the same time, I will say, you know, the pandemic, you know, has caused these economic issues, these financial issues where we're talking about cuts at institutions of higher education. There's budget cuts across the board. The pandemic also has highlighted how connected the world is, right? This is a global issue. This is a global pandemic. It's not specific to a country or a continent or anything like that. And it will take a global solution. And so collaboration across international borders can't go away anytime soon. It's not going away anytime soon. So, you know, and that is perhaps maybe one of the best arguments for international education, right? That if we don't participate in education internationally, then we are also not connected to those solutions as we need to be.
Sure. Excellent point. So we do have another question coming in. For those students who see their careers grounded in an institution-based institutional research office, what's been learned about quote unquote best practices from these projects?
So basically, I'm an IR person at a system office, not at a campus. Right. You know, never has an institutional research office been more important in the history of higher education. Data is being demanded to answer all of the salient issues pressing in higher education right now. So first of all, be proud of where you sit. That's awesome. Best practices. So as Melissa has spoken to it a couple of times, this siloed data. To the extent to which you as an institutional research office can build skills and advocate for merging those data sets and bringing them together. This takes some data governance work in order to standardize data definitions. It takes some privacy work to make sharing across those offices palatable to people in those separate offices and to want to participate. But working to merge those data sets has immense power to be able to speak to the effectiveness of the different initiatives going on in your campus. So we're speaking today about study abroad, but that is true, I'm sure, of all kinds of student experiences or faculty experiences that you in the institutional research office have the skills, and it is your job to do this type of inquiry. So to bridge that space between siloed databases to be able to speak more authoritatively about the impact of these experiences is really, really critical role right now.
Excellent. Dr. Whatley, anything to add on that in particular?
Well, actually, I'll turn to another question that has come in. So Justin has asked about, and we'll continue to talk about silos, but a different kind. What ideas do you have for leveraging study abroad opportunities to actually enhance international education as a whole, rather than keeping things isolated and in silos? So unfortunately, the trend has been that study abroad has continued to isolate itself from the larger international education conversation, and is often allowed to do so as a result of the way institutions prioritize and reward study abroad success. So things like outbound student numbers. And I think that comes back to what I was saying earlier about the pandemic forcing us to pause and really reconsider why do we exist, right? Why does study abroad exist? Those outbound student numbers this academic year are going to be essentially zero, right? So no one is getting rewarded for study abroad participation this year. And it is a perhaps not exciting for many people, exciting for me as someone who researches this area and doesn't, get paid to organize study abroad programs anymore. It is exciting to see the opportunity that the field has right now to pause and reassess, right? And I think that brings us back to other areas of international education that we've perhaps been ignoring in privileging study abroad. So, you know, well, if the purpose of study abroad is to build intercultural competency among students, well, can they do that at home by interacting with international students? Can they do that at home taking courses that have been globalized? Can they do that at home in a virtual exchange kind of situation? And that almost forces study abroad to become part of the broader international education conversation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We have a really interesting question here about the rise or perceived rise in populism and nationalism and how that affects this kind of work, both on the research side and on the federal funding and programs offered.
I do see it shaping give me a second, thinking as I put words out there. I mean, I definitely see that there will be an impact, not just in terms of actual policy, but as there is this rise in populism and nationalism, the people who are in leadership positions on boards for institutions, for example, may increasingly bring with them those perceptions. So I think that points to the ever increasing importance of the work that we're doing, that speaks to the tangible benefits of international education. And as Melissa and Justin Jeffrey's question point out, not just study abroad, but other aspects of international education as well. So I think that it just ups the ante for us to provide as much empirical evidence of the positive benefits for all students of increased internationalization and in particular for today's topic, study abroad.
I mean, and I'll add, you know, Angie, you mentioned the positive impact of international education, of things like study abroad. Also the negative impact. That is an area for future work that I would really like to see become better developed. We don't know a whole lot about what the negative impact might be. I mean, if we think about specifically study abroad, what is the impact of study abroad programs on the host communities where we run these, you know, massive study abroad programs? How does that impact the host community, and is that good, right? You know, if we're thinking specifically, you know, going back to Julianne's question about populism and nationalism, thinking about the experiences of international students who come to the United States during this particular political moment. What are their experiences like, and is that good, right? I think, I mean, I keep going back to this point about we've assumed that international education is good, and I don't think we can make that assumption anymore. I think, you know, we may be contributing to some of this rise of populism and nationalism.
Sure. And thanks to Julianne O'Connell for that question. Okay, I think we still have time for a couple more. If you want to go ahead and just enter those questions into the Q&A box. And to Doctors Bell and Whatley, are there any things that kind of came to mind as, you know, we've been talking today that that maybe you wanted to say more about? Some things maybe you've processed since they were asked.
One thing I wanted to add is I left out in our areas of future research that the second prong of the CASI work is looking at outcomes of students who participate in taking world languages in college, and same outcomes as we're looking at for study abroad. Certainly world language departments and faculty are under fire these days. And so again, it's important that we understand those dynamics and relationships to student success. And that's the area of the project that we're in right now.
Excellent.
And obviously those who study abroad and those who take advanced foreign language studies heavily intertwine.
Right.
Well, and I will mention maybe as, my last bit here that I mentioned earlier, I'm happy to talk about my community college work, and I never did. Community college international education looks very different from four-year institution international education. We've spent a lot of time talking today about inclusive policies and practices and how can we open up opportunities to students. Almost by default, community college international education has to be inclusive. It has to provide access. I mean, that's open access is part of the mission of the community college just in general. And it's not just open access to the institution, it is also open access to the opportunities offered by the institution. And international education is one of those opportunities, whether that is study abroad or other international opportunities. And so, I always say this, if a four-year institution is looking to make their policies and practices more inclusive, they need to look at what the community college down the road is doing. We see really innovative stuff happening at community colleges, not the least of which may be because they exist on very limited budgets.
Right.
And so, I'll just put a plug in there for the community college international work that is happening. It offers a great example for people who may be, located at four-year institutions.
Excellent. Okay, I think we have time for just one more, maybe.
Just random thoughts or
Great.
graduate study abroad. I do want to just acknowledge that the study abroad experiences that I had while I was at IHE were phenomenal and really exponentially enhanced my experience as a graduate student. And probably also contributed to my longer term interest in this as an area of inquiry.
Right. And Dr. Bell, can you speak a little bit to that? Can you talk about what those experiences were?
So this is ancient history. This was back in the early aughts, but we had an opportunity while Croatia was trying to enter the EU to go and speak to leaders in Croatia about educational transformation. And as you probably noticed today, I speak very fast. And so when I was trying to present to these Croatian leaders, they actually stopped me and were like, slower, please. But to get an opportunity to present was one thing, but just to be in the room to hear all the conversations about what that country was grappling with in order to meet EU standards was just a phenomenal experience. And then there was also the project going on to go to Oxford and speak with other institutions in England about educational issues, present my work to an international group, benefit from their input about what I was doing based on the American experience and talk about their experiences in other countries was just absolutely amazing. Plus to spend time with those scholars with different perspectives was phenomenal, eye-opening, really kind of revolutionary.
Amazing. Dr. Whatley, did you have any experiences as a graduate student?
I did. When I was a master's student, I studied abroad. And it was, I think at that point I had already decided what I wanted to do. I studied abroad several times as an undergrad. For those of you who know me, I mean, my academic background is in Spanish linguistics. And so I've had an international focus for a very long time. But I studied abroad in Morocco as a master's student. And it certainly, sorry y'all, it wouldn't be an academic talk if Bernice didn't make it an appearance. She was going to start barking if I.
She gets the last word, so.
I mean, but it certainly enhanced the quality of my master's degree, you know, and I think providing those kinds of experiences for graduate students is really, really important, and is something that, you know, we probably need to focus a good bit more attention on.
Sure, excellent. And we are out of time, but I just want to ask Bernice if she has anything final that she wants to say about study abroad or no, Bernice, nothing. Okay.
About as far as she travels from home is the backyard. That's far enough for her.
It's good to see her anyway. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Whatley and Dr. Bell. I think this has been a really wonderful conversation. We look forward to continuing to follow your work and really excited about, the future opportunities for study abroad and what that looks like relative to equity. So thank you so much for your participation today. Thanks so much to our audience for wonderful questions. Everyone stay well, stay healthy, stay hydrated. And hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much
Thanks
for
so
having
much.
me.
Thanks so much, everybody.